Hello, everyone, and welcome to another adult ed session for SEPC. We're back here, me and my friend Austin. To remind you who Austin is, she is a friend of mine from seminary. She has an MDiv. She currently lives in Berkeley, and she is really working on her plan for, making this pandemic and possibly the next one just the best it can be for her. Gathering community. She's just really playing a important role in lots of people's sanity right now. So she has willingly joined me for another session here as we talk about unnamed women in the Bible, although we haven't made it out of Genesis yet, so maybe that's a little bit of a misnomer. But here we are talking about another unnamed woman. A little bit about our approach here is we're hoping to honor these women. They are often, background characters. They can be pigeonholed into stereotypes because they're not humanized. They don't have a name. And there's often not a lot of information about them. And so, we're going to approach this with a little bit of wondering, using our sacred imagination tools, and wondering how we can humanize them, complicate this narrative, speak about empowering them in ways that they are recognizing the ways that they are empowered, but also acknowledging, where their stories are hard. I know we definitely saw that in our last one, talking about Mrs. Lot's wife, and his daughters. So as we set this up, Austin, is there anything you want to say about our time together before we get started?
Yeah, mostly I just want to clarify, when Allison says I've been planning for the next pandemic, I've decided to invite 7 of my favorite people to make a plan to quarantine together because I'm alone. I know a lot of people that are alone, and it's pretty dumb. So I'm looking for a house and looking for a ton of people to say, as soon as there's another pandemic, we're holding up together and gonna camp and read and play fun games and talk about unnamed biblical women for anywhere from 6 to 27 months.
Right. I think that's a big part of why I wanted to invite you to do this adult ed with me too, is because this is a way that I get to connect with a friend, and other people hopefully get to connect with us and think about how they can, explore a text together. Maybe other people will start conversations because of the one we're having here. Wouldn't that be awesome? Do it. You should do it. This is great. So today we are going to talk about Potiphar's wife. So we're jumping ahead to Genesis chapter 39. So I'm going to set up a little bit of biblical context for us. So we are jumping right into the middle of Joseph's story. Now, Joseph is a popular character. He's got that amazing Technicolor dream coat. Maybe you've heard the music. But we're jumping right into the middle. So Joseph is favored by his father. He is the youngest of many, many sons. And he gets a vision from God saying that he is going to have power over his brothers, over his father. He is going to be great. He is favored by God. And this does not sit well with his brothers. And so they actually make up a plot to kill him. They don't go through with it, and they decide instead to give him into slavery. And so he is sold to slave traders. He's enslaved and is then purchased by Potiphar, who is one of the officials of Pharaoh in Egypt. And so we come into this story. Joseph is in this household in Egypt, and he is given basically control of the household. He's told by Potiphar, like, you're the number one man under me, and it's all like under your jurisdiction. So that's kind of the scene we're set. But just before this story, there is another I would say, difficult story about Tamar. And Austin, what should we know about that story before we jump into this one?
Yeah, well, it's sort of a strange placement for it because chapter 37 is talking about Joseph being sold into slavery in Egypt. And then chapter 38 switches to a different one of the brothers. Judah is one of Joseph's older brothers, and switches into his family story right before going back to Joseph in Egypt in 39. And so I think it's important that these stories be read together to some extent. And chapter 38 with Judah and Tamar, Tamar is not an unnamed woman. She has a name, which is very significant for these characters. And Tamar is someone who fights for the rights that she, by law, is supposed to have. So she marries one of Judah's sons, Judah's oldest son, and that son dies, and she has no children. And so now she is a widow, and Judah's family has the responsibility of protecting her. And so widows are a vulnerable population. It's important for them to have children to continue maintaining their status in the family. And so Judah is faithful to that law. He has Tamar marry the second son, Onan. Onan is very disrespectful to Tamar, to say the least. So Onan has sex with Tamar, but then doesn't allow her to become pregnant. So essentially raping her instead of being faithful to the law. And so she goes to live with her family until the youngest son is old enough. Onan dies. It says God strikes Onan dead for his faithlessness. And so Tamar is waiting to have the next son as her husband so that she can have protection under her husband's family. Judah never lets the youngest son marry Tamar, and Tamar is sort of an outcast, and she decides to claim her rights in Judah's family. And so she disguises herself as a prostitute and goes to the place where Judah is getting his sheep sheared, details that you didn't need. But she tricks Judah into sleeping with her and getting her pregnant. And then Judah finds out that his daughter-in-law is pregnant and says, "We're going to burn her," which is very dramatic. Which is a line that I hadn't noticed until I read it this morning. But then Tamar shows them that she has the seal and the signet ring of Judah to say, "This is the man that got me pregnant." And Judah says she has more faith than I do, and realizes that she was in the right. So this is a difficult and weird and strange story. But in the context of this time and the way that it's written and the intention of the story, Tamar is renowned for claiming her rights and taking agency to participate in the law in the way that it's supposed to be. So she's a hero, and she comes right before Joseph and Potiphar's story in the next chapter. Back to you in the studio, Allison.
Yeah, it's interesting to have these two stories kind of back to back that really force us to acknowledge women's bodies and sex and things that we tend to not want to talk about, the things that I think the Bible even maybe doesn't always want to address. And so having these two things together really does allow us to ask questions of them both to understand what are we supposed to be getting out of this, if anything, like what. So as we heard, the story of Tamar is difficult, and this story that we're about to read is also a difficult one. There is some coercion and power dynamics at play here, and so I just want to give you a heads up for that again, we're going to be open to what God is speaking to us through these difficult texts, but acknowledging that if we're not in a place to maybe approach that right now, then that is totally okay. We are going to be Genesis 39. I'm going to start reading the end of verse 6 and go through verse 20, I think. 23? No, 20. We'll go through 20. Now Joseph was handsome and good looking. And after a time, his master's wife cast her eyes on Joseph and said, "Lie with me." But he refused and said to his master's wife, "Look, with me here, my master has no concern about anything in the house, and he has put everything that he has in my hand. He is not greater in this house than I am, nor has he kept back anything from me except yourself, because you are his wife. How then could I do this wickedness and sin against God?" And although she spoke to Joseph day after day, he would not consent to lie beside her or to be with her. One day, however, when he went into the house to do his work, and while no one else was in the house, she caught hold of his garment, saying, "Lie with me." But he left his garment in her hand and fled and ran outside. When she saw that he had left his garment in her hand and had fled outside, she called out to the members of her household and said to them, "See, my husband has brought among us a Hebrew to insult us. He came into me to lie with me, and I cried out with a loud voice. And when he heard me raise my voice and cry out, he left his garment beside me and fled outside." Then she kept his garment by her until his master came home. And she told him the same story, saying, "The Hebrew servant whom you brought among us came into me to insult me. But as soon as I raised my voice and cried out, he left his garment beside me and fled outside." When his master heard the words that his wife spoke to him, saying, "This is the way your servant treated me," he became enraged. And Joseph's master took him and put him into prison, the place where the king's prisoners were confined, and he remained there in prison. The word of the Lord.
Thanks be to God.
So, Austin, our unnamed woman seems like quite the villain. Can you break that down a little bit to help us know how to approach this?
Yeah, she does seem like a villain. And one of the things that I think is really important to notice about stories, Bible stories especially, is that there are different kinds of villains. And I think often we clump them all together. And so I want us to think about, is she a narrative villain? Somebody who is getting in the way of the trajectory of the plot, someone who complicates the story, someone who adds tension to whether or not the plot is going to be continued forward. And so, all of Genesis relies on God's promise to Abraham to have children and land and to be multiplied. And so time after time, these stories are getting complicated by a threat to whether or not that promise is going to come true in the way that we expect it to. So if Potiphar is getting in the way, or Mrs. Potiphar is getting in the way of Joseph's manifesting God's plan in Egypt, then that's what creates the dramatic tension in the story for us. So is a villain in the stories that we're reading, is a villain going to be someone who's just getting in the way of the plot of the story? Or is somebody a moral villain that is transgressing moral laws that we want to uphold? And I think those are the two poles, but then there's a spectrum in between of where our villains are going to fit along that line. I think often when we're presented with narrative villains, we like to moralize their behavior without questioning it. And I think that's something we should be critical of tradition in and be aware of ourselves when we're reading and how we're seeing these villains. And so I think Potiphar's wife, Mrs. Potiphar, falls in two different categories of characters throughout Genesis. And one of those categories is villains, people who complicate the plot, people who get in the way of what it seems like God is trying to do, where the narrative is going. She also belongs in this category of strong women, strong female characters. Many of them are named: Tamar, Rebecca, countless others, and probably not countless. You could probably count them pretty quickly. but I don't want her villainhood to take her away from being in that line of strong women, and vice versa. I think that, it would also, it's tempting to say that, oh, she's a strong woman, so like obviously, maybe she's not a villain at all because she's a strong female character that we should be paying attention to. But the text clearly wants us to know that she's getting in the way of God's work here. Maybe. Stay tuned. That was a
spoiler.
Yeah. But I think it's important to see her in both of those categories and to let them exist simultaneously.
Yeah, I think that's really helpful. I think especially because Joseph names her actions as like wickedness and calls it like why would I sin against God? I guess I'm curious, like, what is the sin there? What are the things that we should, are there ways that we can categorize it to separate her behavior that makes it easier for us to say, like, all right, here are ways we can like look at her as an empowered woman, and here are ways that maybe like we can understand that like everything she does isn't great. I mean, for example, I think that a lot of scholars point to the fact that like this would be an act of adultery. And I think in our modern context, we would talk a lot about consent. But I think it feels really complicated, especially because Joseph like names it as wickedness. But I think it is important to note that it does feel like his naming of the wickedness is about the act, not about her as a person. Mm-hmm. Her desire, her persistence, her sexuality is not the thing that is villainized here. It is this adultery piece. It is this, grabbing of someone who doesn't want to be grabbed, that maybe we can separate as we talk about her, so that we can acknowledge that like her as an abuser, like not good. Her as a like realized woman, like that is a good thing. Mm-hmm. So I don't know if there's anything else. I think that's just how I kind of have to hold it in.
It's helpful to have a humanized female character because,
yeah,
especially if they're unnamed, like you said before, often we just scapegoat them or like use them as a trope to further the story rather than trying to understand a character as a full human. And I think like she gives us a complicated picture of a human that's helpful to pay attention to.
Yeah. I think something that would be interesting to chat about is her authority, or like who has authority here. As you mentioned with Tamar, like she kind of like flips things on their head and is like taking back authority. So I'm wondering, where do you see the power in the text as you listen to it today?
That's a great question. And the more I read through this chapter, the more I saw some narrative devices where it feels like the story is leading you one way, and then all of a sudden it switches, and you feel like you're taken off guard, or it's taken a curve in a direction that you didn't expect. Which, great storytelling, right? That's what they're supposed to do. They're supposed to surprise you, and I think that this chapter is meant to surprise us because the way it starts out, it seems that Mrs. Potiphar is the one with the power. But slowly that seems to shift throughout the chapter, and she becomes more of a powerless character who's employing devices of cunning and shrewdness to be almost a trickster figure, trying to assert her power in ways that are creative because she doesn't have as much power as it seemed like she did at the beginning. So that's really interesting because most tales of sexual exploitation in the Bible do not show a powerful woman. They show a man taking advantage of a woman. So this is unique.
It is interesting too, because the way that Joseph sees the power is like he holds it. He sees himself as overseeing the household. He even puts himself level with Potiphar, not even like, oh, I'm his right hand man. He's like, there's no, like, we are equal in power. And the only thing separating us is you, Mrs. Potiphar. But it is interesting that the power does seem to shift. I think with our like contemporary lens, we would say there's a power dynamic of she's, trying to seduce him, so she holds the power. But I do think that like within biblical context, that isn't really true. I know that like the way that like female slaves are expected to, their bodies are however a man wants to use them, versus male slaves were not treated in the same way. And even though Joseph is here, like he really is claiming the power. I noticed as I was reading this time that in verse 14, it says she called out to the members of her household. And it names it as her household rather than like Potiphar's household or Joseph's household.
Mm-hmm.
And so it's interesting. I'm wondering about the shift that happens there and what we're supposed to be seeing. Because I really do think that in that moment, it's like, oh, the cards are in her hand. She's the one who then gets Joseph put into jail. And I think that's, from the perspective of Joseph, which we normally would look at, it feels like you think you're in control and then God shows you otherwise. But it's strange if we focus on her to understand, I don't know, how she gets to use this. She has to use this cunning to like reclaim her own household.
I'm also really curious about her motivations. Like, are they competing to be head of the household when Mr. Potiphar is away? Because one of the only commentary I read, the only one I have access to, talked about how usually the wife would be the head of the household. And so the fact that this male slave is honored above the wife of a household, I wonder if that's something that really bothered her, that caused this competitiveness between the two. And also what I didn't learn until last week talking with Allison is that Potiphar was likely a eunuch, being one of the Pharaoh's lead officials. And when it talks about Potiphar being really prosperous, it never mentions children, which is usually something that would be mentioned if a person was prosperous. And so there's a lot of different motivations that we could wonder about in Mrs. Potiphar. There's the competitiveness, there's sexual desire, there's, would there be a push for trying to get pregnant? I don't know. It doesn't mention that. But maybe that's supposed to be one of the compare contrasting of Mrs. Potiphar's cunning versus Tamar's cunning. But that's just something that I've been curious about.
Yeah, I think too, another thing in there would be the gender dynamics that we haven't really talked about. We talked, I guess, a little bit when I mentioned the difference between male and female slaves. But it's interesting to me that Mrs. Potiphar, the way that this is introduced, that like, oh, Joseph is a really good-looking guy, makes it seem to me that they're trying to paint Mrs. Potiphar in this like weakness, like, oh, I am but a woman, I can't resist this handsome guy, especially like whatever her relationship with her husband is. We don't need to talk about that. But then it flips it to like make her powerful. So it's just interesting because it feels like her weakness comes from her femininity of like her attraction to this manly man. But then when she's like put into power, a lot of her characteristics she's given are ones that are more ascribed to masculine characters in the Bible. I don't know. Did you notice any other places where there's like gender stereotyping going on in the story?
Yeah, I think like the way that she commands, like, lie with me. She doesn't even try to like seduce him. She doesn't try to, she doesn't have to use those trickster cleverness.
Dress up as a prostitute or hide her. Yeah.
Acting as if she has the power to make a demand that will be listened to. And so that's a really masculine way to speak. But then later she has to start employing the more cunning trickster kind of cleverness instead.
But it's after the fact, because I feel like even the fact that she grabs him feels like a very like women just aren't portrayed as physically dominant ever.
Well, that's a really interesting scene. It feels like that might be the turning point of her power. We see her in this role where she's able to make demands, but as soon as she tries to act like a man would, that power falls apart.
Mm-hmm.
And that's when she starts trying to be more cunning and lie and get people on her side because she needs to do that and be political.
Yeah. And her like ultimate power comes through her husband, right? Like Joseph wouldn't be in jail if it weren't for Potiphar saying, "Oh, I believe my wife." Like,
and if the roles were reversed, if that was a man telling a female slave, "Lie with me," and she says no, he could just force her. And like, I think that's the biggest difference that we're seeing now with male power and Mrs. Potiphar's power, is that when she tries to act on it, it falls apart. And we realize that her power wasn't what it seemed.
Mm-hmm. Another area where I'm curious about how gender might play into it is I was reading about, Joseph being portrayed as this wisdom character, right? He like has these visions, he has insight from God. And he now has power and he's going to help Pharaoh. So if he's this wisdom character, then that means Mrs. Potiphar, by contrast, is seen as anti-wisdom. I don't know how I feel about that. It feels a little bit dangerous to have this like seemingly empowered woman who is making bad choices be seen as like anti-wisdom personified. I'm wondering if you have any thoughts about that too.
Yeah, I think like the theme of complicating the narrative is really helpful. And I think comparing and contrasting her with Tamar is helpful too. Like you can see the contrasts where she's acting outside of the law. She's acting in a way that doesn't honor those around her. She's acting selfishly rather than to bring about children. And so those are contrasts, but there's also the comparison of being a strong female character who is acting in ways that she has access to and claiming her own agency. I think it's okay to let those exist next to each other. But also I'm thinking back to Hagar. And I think that there's a relationship we're supposed to see in the Abraham, Sarah, Hagar story and this one. If you remember, Hagar was the Egyptian slave girl that Sarah gave to Abraham and said, like, maybe this is how you will bear children because I'm too old. And it was actually Hagar's descendants, the Ishmaelites, who sell Joseph into slavery in Egypt. So I'm wondering if that's something that we're supposed to be noticing, a relationship that Mrs. Potiphar is an inversion of Hagar, because now she is the woman in power and the Egyptian, and Joseph is the one that can be taken advantage of. I wonder if there's some like kind of karma in that, or what we're supposed to notice there. But I think like that Hagar story is an important prefiguration of this story, and I think there's some relationship from Potiphar to Hagar and Potiphar to Tamar, and I think they all have more in common than the narrative wants to admit to us, maybe.
Or that we notice at least, because they're not the main characters. I mean, I think Tamar is a little bit the main character of her story, but I think that's where some of the trouble comes for me when I think about like Mrs. Potiphar is anti-wisdom, because it like she's unnamed. We can bend her into a stereotype without humanizing her a lot easier than we can for someone like Tamar. And so I think connecting her back to Tamar and to Hagar, yeah, I think that is really
Yeah.
helpful.
Yeah. And seeing like some of our heroes, Sarah and Abraham, treating their servant in a similar way that Mrs. Potiphar is treating Joseph.
Yeah.
Yeah, so I think as we humanize villains, we also have to realize that some of our heroes are also just people that can make mistakes and make poor choices.
Absolutely. So we've talked a lot about connection and how this story kind of fits in, but I wonder, like, what is the purpose of this story? And I guess I'm kind of wondering more of like, what is God's role in this, and like, what is this passage, what is this character of Mrs. Potiphar revealing to us about God? And I think that fits a little bit with how you were talking about a narrative villain, right? Like, she's plunked in here to give us some drama, to think like, oh, like, will God be foiled by a simple human and some sexual desire?
That's the voice at the end of the episode saying, wait until next week to see what happens.
Right, exactly. This is a cliffhanger, where we've left it. And I don't know if this is a question I need you to answer, but just, I guess a question that you posed before was, is God working through her or in spite of her? And I feel like part of me wants to redeem her a little bit by saying God is working through her. Like, this isn't like, she did these things for a grand purpose, maybe even like take some of the ownership away from her. I don't actually think that that's empowering. I think that's taking away her power,
making her a pawn in a way.
right? And I don't like that. I don't like a God who uses people as pawns either. But I do think there's something there that we can, I don't know, think about, at least going forward, is what does God do in these situations? Are we people who expect God to be foiled so easily? Or are we people who read the end of the story and we're like, it's going to be fine. Like, we have hope that it's going to work out because God told Joseph in a vision that it's going to be a certain way. Rather than focusing on like, this is a story about how to not be a wicked woman.
Yeah, I think what I glean from this is that God's work is more mysterious than heroes and villains. I think that's really helpful to keep telling myself. I think the more polarized our own world gets, the more I want to find both heroes and villains and make people into those things. And I don't think that ends up being helpful. So I think one thing that I take away from this is I want to be more curious about people's full humanity. I want to be skeptical of how people are portrayed, if it's all or nothing, hero or villain. But also thinking of that moment where we end the chapter and Joseph is in prison and it seems like, how's God going to get him out of this one? And like thinking of the unimaginable future that connects where we're at to where we've been promised we're going to get. I think seeing a story like this gives me a lot more hope for the kind of creativity that's going to fill in those blank spots of the future. And even if I don't know what my future is going to look like, or the future of our nation, or how God's going to fill in those dark spots between where we are and what we think the promise is, seeing a story and seeing God fill in those points, it's helpful for me to locate myself. Like, okay, right now I'm like Joseph in prison, and I don't know what's coming in chapter 40, but like the last time Joseph was in prison, something happened. God did something. And to me, these Bible stories have so much of that to offer, seeing a whole narrative arc, so that when we can't see our own narrative arc, we have more hope in the unimaginable future.
I really love the way that you said it the other day when we were chatting, is allow yourself to ask, I wonder what God could do with this. Instead of being like, oh, I've hit the wall. Like, I mean, yeah, I think it's okay to, like, you've hit the wall, like, get the pint of ice cream, take the nap. Like, there are things to, like, take care of yourself, but to also be in the practice of acknowledging God with us, God working. I do think it's a practice that we have to embrace, because it doesn't always come naturally. It doesn't come naturally for me. I know that for sure. And so, yeah, I really like that. I wonder what God could do with this.
And it takes hope to be curious like that, doesn't it? It feels easier sometimes to just say nothing's going to happen, because then we don't have to be disappointed if it doesn't. But that's like stepping out in faith to me means being hopefully curious about what might come next. And I think that's a muscle we have to practice. And for me, reading good stories is how I practice that kind of imagination, so that I'm ready to wonder when I need to.
Yeah. Are there any other final thoughts before we, I mean, I feel like that was kind of a good, hopeful piece to end on, a charge to be curious, and to look toward hope. But are there other final thoughts you have?
I think that's a good place to end
Okay.
it. Yeah.
I can tell sometimes if you freeze or if we're just being quiet. Both are appropriate in this age of Zoom. Well, thanks again for joining me, Austin. We both talk about how it just feels like it takes so much energy to, like, start a thing, and then we get into it and we realize the blessings that come from it. And I've certainly
thank you for having me. It's been really helpful to think through these stories. I feel much better after getting to the end of this one. I'm exhausted in a good way.
Yeah, sure. We hope that anyone who's tuned in to our, very popular YouTube,
like below, subscribe.
Yeah.